everybody.
Hello, hello.
Okay, I think let's get started. I think that's most of the folks who normally, well, a couple people missing, but why don't we get started? So welcome. If there's anyone new and like to say hi, happy to say hi.
This is my first time in this meeting.
I'm sorry, was someone speaking? I sounded like I heard something quietly. Was that just me or no?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Hello.
Very low microphone volume.
Oh,
Maybe you just
okay.
need to.
Yeah. So, all right, I'll speak louder.
That's good.
Hello, my name is Nick Vidal. I just joined this meeting. It's my first time, and I I rejoined the open source initiative, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about uh, this work that you're developing.
Great, welcome, Nick. I think that's everyone. I think I recognize everyone else. So welcome. So we did a release of the release candidate on Friday, kind of at the end of the day, because it took the whole week to get all the changes in. But we announced it on the blog, on the salsa.dev blog. Thank you everyone who contributed both to the specification itself and also comments on the blog post. So hopefully we'll get feedback on the spec itself. I think we still have a list of things that we would like to do for the stable release. There's still, like, if we look at the project board, there's still a bunch of bugs open around clarity, terminology, consistency across the site, etc. So I'm still planning on working on that and getting that out. I don't have any particular topics on that front other than just like keep plugging along at that. Also, I don't know if they just sent out a pull request. We have hired a company, Cycle, to do a layout change, because right now there's no nav bar on the, like, to jump between pages. And so they have they put together a bunch of like theme changes so that way you could kind of navigate between pages. And a couple people on the call here have looked at their initial design, and so I think they should be sending out this week, I think. So that at least will help navigation.
Just to clarify, Mark, when you say we hired, that was Google, right?
Sorry, yes. Google paid the money for them. Yeah.
I think it's worth to
Sorry.
give the.
So I should be, yes, I should have been more clear. Yes, yeah. Google.
No, it's
Google.
worth giving the credit in this case. You guys pay. You didn't. The trend in OpenSSF land these days is, hey, go ask the tag for money. In this case, you guys just did it. So thanks.
Yeah. And thanks. We got like, again, an initial round of feedback from, again, several folks in the call, and so that should be landing this week. Any other topics, either about the oh, sorry, I thought something said that. Any other topics?
Well, working through the conformance program stuff. So that's going well. I've done a first draft of the terms of service and compliance guide and stuff. And me and Chris, I got some comments out for you on that point. But hopefully we can get back to the Linux Foundation lawyers and keep the progress moving forward on that item there.
Great. So yeah, so I think where we landed with that was that is not part of the specification itself, but is like a meta layer on top. Is that where we agreed? That like it's how you show that you've conformed to the 1.0 specification?
Yeah, so closely aligned, but not directly, but not contained within the spec. Yeah, but aligned with the spec.
Right, yeah, that sounds great. Anything else? Might be a short meeting.
So, I mean, Mark, we had a list of like, what we thought we must have to get the 1.0 out. Are we going to go take another look at this and say, okay, now that we are done with the 1.0 for now, at least while we wait for comments, should we go to the next layer of things maybe we want to start tackling?
Sure, yeah, that's a good idea. So let me present the here it is. I'll make the window a little bit smaller so it's not so tiny. I think there's, so just kind of summarizing what's here. There should be a proper what's new page that's kind of missing. We have the blog post. We just didn't get this out in time, and we erred on the side of sending out the release candidate without it rather than having this. But we have the blog, we referenced the blog post currently for a summary of the differences. There's like tracking changes. I think actually these two should be marked as duplicates of one another. Around like, and I think there's another one about semantic versioning, basically how we version the spec that we should get in before the final. Compare, showing where SLSA is, making sure that SLSA 1.0 and S2C2F are aligned. That also we need to do. I think the verification story probably needs more work. It would be helpful if we had feedback from readers, but I think there's like a bunch of to-dos, and it's not, at least in my mind, it's not super clean yet. In particular, oh, that's actually a good topic. Thanks for saying this. Let me add that to the agenda. So build levels, do the build levels include verification, like expectations, or is that like a separate thing that I think needs to be worked out? Compliance program, I think we should now mark as not part of the 1.0 release, so maybe we'll remove that. Same thing here. We need to resolve that question. The threats.md, I think, could still use more work. There's some to-dos there. there's kind of more, I think, just clarity type of things. So we could go through this list. It's actually, some of these need to be marked as fixed. But I think there's like a bunch of to-dos and like kind of open items just for cleanups. In terms of this one, I think is mostly identified. I think some of these maybe will, so some of these are kind of like, we had comments that this thing is unclear, and it would be good to just ping whoever reported and say like, do you think this is clear now? Or get feedback, because it's kind of hard to know like when is it good enough, because we've kind of partially addressed it, but it's not clear if we've done enough. I think the terminology section, we have a couple months ago, we talked about like package terminology of like package name versus artifact versus repository, et cetera. I'd like to get that merged in. Yeah, these are kind of like the nice to haves. But if we don't get them in, I think it's, in my opinion, at least it's okay. So yeah, actually I need to go through a pass of marking some of these as fixed. Yeah, actually, so one, I guess the big piece of feedback that came up, that's right, because we didn't meet last week, so we didn't discuss, was the build levels and expectations, like the expected, for example, expected source repo. Right now, it is listed as part of the build level, so it's also this. Where is it? So for example, in the security levels, the build track, as part of the build track, I guess I could look at the release candidate page. As part of the build track, by the way, can you let me know if I need to zoom in or anything if it's not readable? I am right here, since you can't see my URL. Setting expectations is part of the track, and then what the track gives you is checking that it was built like according to those expectations, and then like evading verification, like that is part of like the guarantee. Oh crap, sorry, click the wrong button. Thank you, Melba. Okay. So let me say again. So setting now can you see the levels page? Okay, thank you, sorry. So like setting expectations and checking against those expectations, like again, like for example, source repo as the most likely thing, is part of the track. And we say like that you check against those as part of the requirements. And then when you go to the requirements page, like the producer, it's kind of ambiguous right here. One piece of feedback that we got from an implementer was it could be desirable for the level to just mean, at least how I interpret it, the trustworthiness of the provenance itself. So if we look at here, and you go down to the verification piece, we have this diagram that like the level just basically means the build level would mean, is the provenance, like how do I believe that this is correct, that the build was not tampered with, that, you know, it was kicked off according to these parameters, and it wasn't tampered with while it was running, and it wasn't tampered with after the build. So you kind of know where the thing came from. but matching it against like where it should have come from is kind of on top of the build level or separate from the build level. It almost means like, should it be a different track or something? I don't know. It's unclear, but I want to raise this issue with the group in case there's people have thoughts. It's kind of like a philosophical question of like, what does the build level mean? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, for that step 2 piece, I think it kind of also depends on it depends on how you're also like how stuff is getting into the build itself. Like, are you pulling it in or are you pushing it in? As well, right? Because like if you're pulling it in, then it's the builder's responsibility essentially to make sure that it's pulling in only from reliable places, and that it's operating in a relatively secure environment where like DNS is not being spoofed and whatever else. But if the idea is that the something external to it is packaging it up and pushing it into the build, then yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, I was quickly trying to read some notes. Yeah, I think that's right. Like the what we've been calling parameters is effectively the stuff that's being pushed in, and like dependencies are kind of like the things that are being pulled in. Yeah, I think I like the push versus pull. So like what this kind of slight change in philosophy would mean, if we go down this road, would be effectively you can look at an artifact, and sorry if this is like too like philosophical or theoretical, but like if you could just have an artifact and its provenance in isolation of where it's supposed to be published to, like no package name, anything, just like artifact and its provenance, that thing has a level, and you know where the thing came from, kind of just in isolation. That's the property that we had in the previous version of the spec. And that's kind of there's some nice attributes to that. Where I had been kind of pushing toward is like, with just that, you don't get this, like you don't address these threat C in the diagram. And I think Joshua is also, Joshua Locke is not here. But I think I discussed it with him, and I think he was also leaning toward that of like, if you don't do that piece, then you kind of miss that. And this is like Vitsa had presented about that earlier. So that's kind of on the one side. On the other, there is something nice about like an artifact can just be checked, and that part has a name, and you could call it something. And so the question is like, if we call that just like kind of this piece the level, do we give this thing a separate name? Is that a track? Is it like, how do you kind of get the end-to-end guarantee? I don't know.
So one other thing that I think is related, right, is if the build does have a way of taking the digest or the hash of all the materials, then you get some implicit verification on step 2, right? Like you'll be able to say, hey, if it says it came from this location, and you go back to check that and hashes don't line up, then you know it didn't actually pull it from the place it said it did in step 2. Right? Because like, let's say I pull down some source code with a particular commit, cool. That has, like, assuming the build itself is secure, then you're pulling in a bunch of stuff. Let's say you pull in also the dependencies, and you can able to take the hash of those dependencies. So like in Nix and Nix OS, they just sort of do the recursive, they take the Merkle hash of that. If you're able to do that, then if you go back and to the location where it pulled from and that stuff doesn't exist, then you know something has gone wrong there.
But there are so many things that can go wrong as the compiler is processing source code.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is exactly how the sunburst attack happened, right? So, I think I'm in agreement with Mark that this is the piece connecting all the different tracks together, source, bill, what have you. I think should be a separate meta track for the lack of a better word.
So maybe I'll just, before Arno, Melba said she can't speak up. But one idea she brought up was basically lump C into the source, the future source track. That like maybe something like level 1 is that you know what source repo is supposed to come from. I think that's at least I hadn't considered that. I think that's worth considering. I think that's a pretty good idea. Arno?
Yeah, I just wanted to react to this notion that, there is so much dependency put on the location, which I'm not completely convinced is the right thing. And I know it's kind of a traditional thing in the security space. You want to know the origin of things, so where it comes from. But fundamentally, going back to the scenario Mike just talked about, what if I go back and it's not there anymore? I know something is fishy. Fundamentally, that's not really that shouldn't be the criteria. What matters is, has it been modified? What, is it the same thing that is really what's important, right? And so I just wanted to hint on the fact, and Mark, I brought that up before in a different discussion. There are different work going on in terms of identifying artifacts independently of the location, to provide an ID for a piece of code. And for those who don't know, is Software Heritage does that because they want to archive all source codes they can put their hands on, and they can't afford to have duplication. So it was, a matter of survival for them to be able to deduplicate, copies of the same code. And finally, they say, well, we need some identification of every piece of code out there with that, carrying where it really is. And so the location is a different attribute. It's separate from the identity of the code. And so I just want to, every time I hear people talk about the location as the key, I feel we're missing out on something.
Well, but I mean, we already do record the digest, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that is already covered by the build track. Like that's definitely there. Well, I guess it's not definitely there. That's a good question. Maybe it should be. Well, there's some challenges there. Let's assume, for the sake of argument for now, that it is recorded. We could get into that in a second. But like, let's say.
No, but maybe to be fair, I mean, maybe it is more secure if you say it has to be the same digest and it has to be the same location. And if it's probably safer to err on that, from that point of view and say, well, I'm not going to take a risk. If it's not there anymore, as Mike was saying, I'm just going to declare this thing unsafe to use. That might be a totally wrong position.
Sorry. But what we need to, every time you build, it's going to be from a different digest, right? And I guess the problem is that we need to know whether that digest is okay, right?
Yes.
And I think that the fact that that digest was located at this particular Git repo and ref, branch or tag, is an indication that the people who had authority to kind of make that determination, to do that push, have said that that commit's okay. I don't know if we could, like, is there any other alternative solution to knowing that?
It kind of makes me think of Git sign and pushing a commit signature to a transparency log. if you could just pull the T-log entry.
So one other thing I think, I mean, that's related, and I think it's something that was one of the core pieces of SLSA. I think that was that what we're kind of, at least for the provenance piece, right, is we're trying to say, we're trying to eliminate the build system potentially as an attack vector, right? Where, you know, something like the build system itself doing something nefarious to make you think you downloaded these dependencies when you didn't. Where I think that's kind of the thing there, where you know, there's nothing to prevent, I think right now, from SLSA to a SLSA build service from downloading malicious source or malicious dependencies and still building a malicious artifact, right? It's just that it helps with protecting against the build system itself, let's say GitHub Actions, from telling you it built X when it really built Y.
Yeah, coming back to the identity of source code, I agree that the digest identifies the bits, but what it doesn't answer is the question is, are these the bits that we should be using? And that's Mark's point. We need to know more than just the identity of source code. We also need to know where it came from, or who created it, or something.
Yeah, so a lot of this, I mean, if we have an issue there where we're gonna take a look at S2C2F and then SLSA version 1, and we're gonna make sure that there's proper alignment. But in doing that, I think what gets accomplished is a lot of the policy and procedural items that should happen beforehand. Are you mirroring? It is mirroring a repository internally. Is that, are we going to say that that should be one of the requirements that should be built into any organization that's going to be using open source or third-party binaries, right? If we're saying that, and then we're constructing SLSA with these things in mind, then I know that those are included and S2C2F, for instance, when it comes to ingestion and scanning and all that kind of stuff. So coming back into SLSA, there are certain things like, yes, location is important from that standpoint, right? Are engineers going out of band to pull in components? Like there's a lot of ifs going on. There's a lot of ifs here that are creating a lot of the arguments that we're having. Let's say arguments, but the discussion that's facilitated right now is being facilitated by a lot of ifs that we can dispel. We can dispel some of these ifs and then create an environment saying this is what should be happening. Of course, we can also say, well, we don't know if that's happening or not. Let's operate it as if it is or it isn't, and then construct it that way. But I think that creates a lot of the confusing trains of thought as we go through this now. That's the only commentary I have with that there.
So sorry, just to chime in, maybe I'm missing something, but maybe isn't this the whole point of having eventually tying all the attestations together? I propose something like the source attestation, which we don't quite have yet in toto, but which might cover exactly use cases like this. So you have a source attestation that signs things like the commit tree digest, and then you glue it with the verifier will put these pieces together, the source attestation and build attestation, to see that what went out of source matches what went into source. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so I had some clarification on that, right? I mean, are we trying to establish just a repeatable process of where the build came from, so we could flag and understand that repeatable process? Doesn't matter how many times we do it or where the source is coming from, we should be able to have that repeatable process, right? Regardless, or I don't know, just try to think out loud here, like just like we do social securities or people that come from different countries and we track them as well, right? But how do we just track as a first phase, as opposed to trying to say, yes, Gilbert came from, I don't know, Mexico, or Gilbert is now here in the US. It's just some food for thought.
Yeah, I think if we do take it on, I think it's like something that is very much separate from the provenance spec piece of SLSA. It's kind of its own thing of, hey, when we're producing stuff, is this coming from trusted locations, and has this been verified through other means, right? Because I think that's going to come in, it's, I think, in my opinion, this is similar things we saw with some of the stuff like with the CNCF supply chain best practices, with NIST's SSDF, with a bunch of the different sort of standards and frameworks sort of out there, is that, there is the build, which is sort of saying, I'm going to take a bunch of stuff and turn it into another thing. And there is potentially things that you can do there to verify that, yes, I'm pulling it from an approved location. And then there are things within the build that can be done, like linting, security scans, yada, yada. And then separately, there's also stuff that can be done at the source and dependency side to sort of indicate, am I pulling something that is trustworthy? But those two things are somewhat separate and also involve a lot of other things. And so I just want to make sure that folks also recognize that that's kind of like, or do folks that view it as being different, or do they view it all sort of being one and the same, that like source and dependencies are just as intertwined as the rest of the build is?
I'd say it'd be independent, Mike, because that's always going to change. I can go buy a new car tomorrow, and that's going to be different from, what exists today. But you know what? We have a freeway that's always repeatable, and that I'm always going to get on a freeway. I'm always going to get off an off ramp. So I know I'm making analogies here, but there's always going to be software that's repeatable. Now, if you get on a freeway that's kind of shaky, like if you go on a toll road versus a non-toll road, I don't know. I'm just trying to kind of get the first phase would be, can I take the sources and can I build it always the same way? Even if the sources are different, it's always going to be built the same way, but I'm looking now at the sources that are different, not at that. And also eventually later, I'll look at the build as well. I don't know. Just, okay, I'll pause there.
I guess I've been viewing the dependencies as a separate thing, because actually in your push versus pull model, that like I'm actually liking Melba's idea a lot, of like maybe considering a source track. Ultimately, like to repeat what Vita said, like what makes a particular group of bits the software? Like, let's say I have bash, the source code to bash. Okay, maybe we have some, let's say we have a version of it that everyone in the world somehow magically agrees, yes, that's bash version 4.4 or whatever. If I fork it and change a file, is that still bash? Is that the official bash? I think no, it's not the official bash, because it has been somehow accepted. But how do we record the fact that like it's officially the bash code or not, and like what it's supposed to be? That's, I guess, I think that's almost like an abstract concept, and we have approximations of that. Like one is, it can be found at this particular locator, and that is a sign that it's official, although there's ways to get around that. Another could be, it is signed by this particular identity, public key, for example. That is another approximation that it's official. But again, the signing key could be used or something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think one other thing to, I think that I also don't want to open back up the transitive problem either, because then that becomes a thing of how far along does that go, right? Because you can very easily say, well, like, just as an example, Debian has some patches for a thing, so it's really not the normal source. It's some additional things here that change some of it as well. And it also opens up, right, like it also uses a library that's not the normal library that's normally used as a dependency for, you know, some other build of that same software, which I think kind of, you know, complicates some of it, which is like, I think, I don't think we should go down this path, but I do think that the Nix and NixOS folks do have a lot of interesting thoughts on the matter around stuff like, that's one of the reasons why they capture sort of the Merkle hashes up the tree, where they can say, hey, every build definition is essentially just a Merkle tree of all the other build definitions of its dependencies, which allows it to say, yep, I pulled down this source and then I patched it with these things, which then changes the hash. So then you'll be able to easily determine, like, you know, this build of OpenSSL is different than this other build of OpenSSL in these ways. Which I think is kind of an important, you know, is potentially an important way of doing it. Yeah.
So maybe I'm diverting the discussion a little bit, but this discussion has sort of made me think about some of the concepts coming out of the RATS standard for attestation, where they have this primitive of reference values. And it seems like there seems to be some need for, I forget what RATS stands for, but there seems to be kind of a need perhaps to encode what the sort of trusted reference value is for validation. Is that something that should be in the provenance, or is that more of a, I mean, should the provenance say, if you're going to match an artifact or a dependency, it should be on, you know, the digest and the URI, for example, or should that be up to the consumer to sort of make that decision for themselves? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I follow. Let me try to repeat it to see, but I suspect I got it wrong. Are you saying that, like, if the consumer thinks that they got it from some location, I'm pretty sure I'm getting this wrong, but I'm going to say what it's probably wrong, that they're getting it from a location, and so to them that makes it official? Is that what you're saying? And so,
Well,
like, as long as
so the reference value is really just the way I understand it, is really just sort of the value that you compare something to. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems like perhaps it's not always clear what the consumer, when a consumer receives a piece of provenance, what they should be sort of matching the dependencies to. Because on the one hand, we convey things like the URI, the download location, and the bits, the digest. But does there need to be more information around what the sort of authoritative reference value is that they're comparing to, and how should they know?
yeah, that seems like a similar problem.
So I do think that it's probably worthwhile to think through a little bit, maybe then. So if we're assuming right now, at least source and dependencies are sort of a separate thing from the actual build, do we view that now as something like a high level, let's just assume, you know, SLSA 2.0 for a second, like, not saying, you know, for getting there anytime soon, but like something like SLSA, you know, in the future, you would expect something like a SLSA compliant build system to take in as its input at a high level, like, a higher salsa level, a high salsa build level should take in stuff that has been, salsa source levels or something like that, or salsa dependency levels. And so that would, the interface there would be something like salsa level 1, let's just say for the sake of argument, yeah, I can take in any source and any dependencies, but that doesn't mean it came from a trusted location. Okay, I'm expecting it to come in with a salsa source attestation or whatever. And that would be, in order to hit salsa level 3 in the future, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know how the implications of time together. I guess how I've been thinking of that, like thinking on Melva's idea, would be like effectively right now in this release candidate, we say you have to compare to like the parameters to expectations. Like that would be maybe like a source level 1, that the inputs to the build meet some expectations, and there's maybe different ways you could do that. You could just make sure that it hasn't been changed from the previous version. You could match it to some expected like locator. You could match against a signature. You could do some sort of hopping thing. But maybe that's like a first step for a source level. And then we could add on top of there for other properties that make source good. Is that what you're thinking, Mike, or am I going off on a different tangent?
Hey, can you repeat that one more time?
So I'm trying to think like how would like we'd like iterate on this idea if we made what's currently called threat C in the diagram. Here, let me present that again. Into source level. So like basically the build level would kind of cover these threats DFGH. The source level cover ABC, but really level 1 or the first level only covers threat C. It doesn't say anything about tampering of the source. You're just identifying what is expected, like what makes it official, or I don't know what term we want to use.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I think that sort of depends on how deep we want to go, right? Because, and this is something that I think Isaac Hepworth's diagram shows pretty clearly, and some of the other stuff that I know with like Google's Beyond Corp and some of the other stuff that's coming out also sort of think highlights, right, where you can go as deep as you want to go, right, where you can have say, hey, actually developers never run dev on their own workstations. It should be an approved, remote, isolated IDEs, whether it's Eclipse Che, Remote VS Code, I know Google has a bunch of their internal stuff and so on. Like, does it, we can go as deep as we want to on there, but I think to start off with, at least, I definitely think that step C piece is important. And we just should just say, we might say, right, like, I can imagine it going, step 2 hits like just, is it coming from a trusted party? And then I could see something like step 2.5 becoming something like the expectation from that trusted party is for source, it has gone through a trusted, linting procedure or 2-person code review. And, and some additional things there, right? Some of it is going to be easy to hit from an attestation and verify via an attestation just based on, well, actually, even some of that's not quite, you couldn't quite do that because of, yeah, anyway, I think doing something like, yeah, the expectation is you have 2-person code review, and that 2-person code review is trustworthy, not just like 2 random service accounts on the same thing can just approve whatever. And then over time, right, that can turn into other stuff as well.
Any other opinion on like either for or against that idea of like kind of shifting the expectations of the inputs to the build to a source track.
I think I agree that that makes a lot of sense. My question, I guess, would be, well, would that be for a future release or still for 1.0?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would guess, like, I would be really hesitant to call something a level in the 1.0, like to officially name it a level. Maybe how we organize it, like that we take what we already have, but just lump it together and say, we'd have to see how it looks, but maybe we could start kind of doing the conversation like that of like, this is in the source track. We don't yet have levels defined, but here is something that we think should be part of it. And then in a future release, we actually start to define the levels. I think that's, my guess is like, that's the most that we would do. Because like, we just haven't had enough, like if we want to have a release within a month, I don't think we've had enough thought and discussion around it to really be confident that the level's going to be good.
That makes sense. If I can just say one more thought. The remaining question for me then, I think, is how, just for build levels, how these dependency references, for example, in the resolved dependencies or external parameters, I think, should be parsed, or how they should be verified, given that they are in the build provenance, but they aren't probably going to be authoritative or expected by the, it's not the builder who's saying that those are kind of the sort of, keep using the word authoritative, values for those artifacts.
Yeah, actually, before I get to my other point, I actually really agree with what Marcel said there. I think it's really, I think that's also one other reason why you keep it separate, because you could still have, I think it helps sort of determine which of the areas is the area where the attack is most likely to happen, right? If you have something that isn't hitting, like if you have very trusted source and very trusted dependencies, but not a very good trusted builder, and something goes wrong, the builder that maybe isn't that high level is probably where to look at. The second thing I think is also, when it comes to the source stuff, I do agree that maybe we wait off a little bit, because I think there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of work happening. Like Trishank, sent a link for the stuff that he's looking at with the in toto attestation regarding source attestations. There's a few other attestation types that are being sort of built that are doing similar sorts of things. There's Git sign. There's all these things that are coming out that might be worthwhile just for us to, to maybe take a look at first, and be able to say, maybe even show off a couple of it to help sort of inspire what we might end up doing with it.
Yeah, I think the worst case scenario here is to be able to verify something, you having to download literally everything that goes into the build, which is like a huge chore for a build system, right? And significantly more load than we would want on the upstream as well. It sounds kind of like if you have a bunch of, you have literally tons of dependencies that go into a build, and it takes forever to download NPM anyway on your machine, right? Sometimes it can be gigabytes and gigabytes, and only some of it is used. Would we require someone, a consumer who wants to verify, to download all the dependencies and hash them on their own machine? That sounds like too much to ask of a verifier.
Yeah, I feel like that should be in the principle, because we have this like guiding principles section. If it's not already, I don't know if it is. I feel like that should be part of the guiding principles, that like you can verify things without having to download it all and do it all yourself. That's like kind of the concept. Let me see, is it?
Yeah, at that point, you could just run the build again to some extent, on at least for some projects.
Yeah, that's not listed. I think that's worth actually noting as like a in the principles. Let me add it. Marcella, I think the topic you raise around like verifying the dependencies, we had that, you and I have been discussing on that one issue.
Yeah.
I forget, was that in the InToto repo issue?
I think that we moved it to the SLSA repo. It's issue number 614. I can post a link.
Yeah, that would be good to reference here. Yeah, that sounds like a separate conversation to me, but one that we ought to be having as well. I think like, yeah, my inclination would be to split like the source, which would be the in the provenances, the external parameters, from the resolved dependencies.
Okay.
Just because they're both difficult. If we could divide the problem into two. I see. Yeah, let me add it to the meeting notes. Thanks. Okay, we are almost at the time. I feel like we probably shouldn't get into a new topic now. I thought this conversation was really helpful. It, at least in my head, clarified a lot. I think this was really useful. Any other last parting thoughts? Okay. Well, as always, it was a pleasure talking to you all. And I look forward to getting out a 1.0 stable release. And we'll just kind of continue iterating on the 1.0, polishing it, addressing kind of the next level of priority items, and then hopefully release by the end of the month. So thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.